Okay.
Okay, let's go.
Andre Cilliers with TreasuryONE. Good to see some mining numbers coming through today and boosting some of the earnings for South Africa. But I guess there's lots of other issues we need to talk about. Just starting off with that, though, Anglo Platinum doing incredibly well. We've seen other mining companies as well. That presumably is what's giving this relatively firmer undertone to the rand. And I say relatively because in the circumstances, one might expect that the rand would have been under a bit more pressure.
Well, if you look at the rand, then it is under quite a lot of pressure at the moment, and we have moved to the lower levels quite a bit. I would actually have thought that the numbers from mining houses and how well they're doing would have done a little bit better for the rand, and it's not. I would also have thought that with Mr. President, with Mr. Ramaphosa's announcement last night that we moved back to level lockdown 3, and that they're doing stuff to assist the economy through their tax incentives and delaying tax payments and reinstituting allowances for the unemployed. I would have thought that that does a little bit better for the rand. So I was quite surprised this morning, and be it really literally just missed the 15 levels. The mining numbers, as I say, trade balance figures, all still remaining quite positive, and yet the rand remains under pressure. So I'm a bit surprised.
What has happened in the past week or so, perhaps this month, to the value of the rand, primarily against the US dollar? Because I guess that's the one that we always track it against, just to give all of us a reminder of where we were before the unrest began around about the 8th, 9th of July.
Well, before that, we were very closer to the 14 levels, just above the 14 levels, in the ranges of, call it 1390 to 1420. Then came the new concerns about COVID-19 infections throughout the world. That placed economies a little bit on the back foot. But in our little world of South Africa, it was mainly the unrest in the KwaZulu-Natal that had put the rand under pressure. And I think we've spoken about that before, about the investor confidence that gets negatively influenced by that. Then with that came the Reserve Bank last week that said that they're going to keep interest rates as it is. And if you look at what the interest rate markets had actually priced in, they kind of expected the Reserve Bank to really increase interest rates by 25 basis points on the back of inflation that have breached the mid-level of the target range of 3 to 6%. Now, the last figure, it did come down a little bit again, but slightly still above. And I think people expected the Reserve Bank in anticipation of an interest rate move. And what the Reserve Bank had also said in their press conference afterwards is that it was an unanimous decision not to increase it, and that they do not foresee that they will move on interest rates this year, and that they will maintain a fairly loose monetary policy in aiding the economy back towards growth. And I think that also disappointed markets a little bit and placed the rand under further pressure.
So you mentioned that the unrest had an impact. Often what occurs in cases like this is a little bit of a delayed reaction, a little bit like a concussion. Initially, there's just shock and panic and you don't do anything. But after the analysts start looking at the consequences of it, for instance, we heard earlier in the program today that from the head of the Maritzburg Chamber of Business, that half of the businesses in Pietermaritzburg that have been wiped out, and there's a big percentage of businesses that have taken a terrible toll here, will not be reopening. The owners have been saying to the CEO of the Chamber of Business, they are going to be taking the money and leaving. Now that, I guess if you extrapolate that to others who are invested in South Africa, it would take them a little while to think about it, and then perhaps to act in the same way, divest from the country. Why, if there's 200 investable countries around the world, would you go to one where the police don't protect your investment, as we've seen that happened in the past week? Would that be perhaps something we need to be watching out for on the rand into the weeks and months ahead?
Absolutely, yes. Now, when we spoke last week, we had said that if you look at the rand, and we were looking at reasons as to why it didn't move as much, we had mentioned the fact that, in previous occasions where there was negative news, and I take the appointment of a Minister of Finance for a weekend way back with Mr. Des van Rooyen, and the reaction of the rand, then there was a far lesser reaction during this. And I guess that's got something to do with people needed to tally up the actual cost of the unrest. And now in the aftermath thereof, as you say, the reaction of businesses and how they will react even when they get the insurance payouts for those who do. If they don't open, it's got a very negative effect on economic growth, a very negative effect on employment figures, and just, placing the country further on a backward pace in terms of economic growth, and further increasing the negative feeling from investor side. And we could very well see that that's got an impact on foreign investors as to how they react, whether they reinvest or disinvest. And at this stage, it looks more to the disinvestment side, and that's definitely very negative for the currency.
And what would that do in a classical economic sense when you don't have money coming into the country? You've got to attract it in some way, and you do that through higher interest rates. Is that something that might be in prospect?
That could be something that's in prospect, because you would have to then increase your interest rates quite substantially to attract investment back into the country, and to try and lure people back into the country with investments. But mostly that is always just money that comes into the bond markets, and that's hot money, as I call it, because just as easily as it flows in, as easily it flows out. So what you really need is you need structural reforms to lure back investors on the long term. And that then you need to protect their businesses, and you need to give them a safe haven. Otherwise, you will not be able to lure them back. And that's not something that is very easily to attain. And I think the situation remains fairly unstable throughout the country in terms of this. And don't forget that we have a fair amount of taxi violence in Cape Town, which is also negatively impact on the Western Cape here and the economy here. So all over the country, it's still a very vulnerable situation. And we're not seeing those structural reforms that we need. We're seeing patches, band-aid strips that's being put onto all the problems. And that's a problem.
So what's your outlook for the rand in the short and medium term from here?
Well, the short to medium term does not look fantastically well, but we will have to see, we are now back down to level lockdown 3. We are increasing our vaccination process, and I think the government is doing reasonably well on that end. And we'll have to see how that gels out in terms of economic growth and returning to growth. And we will also have to see what happens in the rest of the world. And then vitally of importance is what happens by the Federal Reserve and their comments on what they will do with interest rates and inflation, and the likes of that out of Europe as well. I think that the rand is most probably for the moment on the upper end of its ranges. And I would foresee that in the short to medium term, we could retrace back down to the 1445, 1475 trading range.